Well, thanks all for having us here tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about neonic pesticides and the concerns they pose for birds, bees, and public health, and all sorts of other concerns as well. I might as well just dive into it. So, you know, our experience with neonics or concern over them begins with the humble honeybee. As this crowd probably knows, bees are incredibly important. They're responsible for 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat, and also hugely important for ecosystems. And to give you a sense of what that looks like on the food side, here is a picture of your typical grocery store today in the world that we live in, one where bees and pollinators still exist. And here's what that grocery store would look like if we had lost our pollinators. So certainly there would still be food. There would just be a lot less of it. We would lose a lot of our most delicious and nutritious options, and all of it would be much more expensive. Beyond the grocery store aisle, bees are also incredibly important for ecosystems. So about 80% of the plants on the face of the earth require bees or other pollinators to reproduce. So if we lose our pollinators, we worry not only about food security risks and food insecurity, but also the collapse of ecosystems. And that's essentially what we are worried about. In the mid-2000s, beekeepers in New York and across the country saw their losses of honeybee colonies just spike through the roof, going from 10-15% a year to 30, 40, 50% virtually overnight. And those numbers have continued to this day. And last year, New Yorkers, these are the US numbers, but last year, New York beekeepers lost 45% of their honeybee colonies, which would have been unheard of 20 years ago. And one other thing to notice too, if you'll notice back in the late 2000s, they were only counting winter losses because the accepted wisdom was you only lost bees in the winter, right? Mostly due to cold. But as we see now, there are years where the summer losses are actually greater than the winter losses. And, they're pretty close in a lot of other years. So something new is going on, right? Something different. And we know whatever is affecting honeybees is also affecting our native pollinators. So, honeybees are not actually native to New York or even the United States. They're livestock. They were brought over from the old country. So we have good numbers on honeybees because they're kept by beekeepers, right? And they know how many bees they have, how many colonies. We don't have the same sorts of good numbers for our native pollinators, but there was a survey done by the state, and the report came out just last summer, finding that between 40 and 60% of native pollinating species in New York, and that's over 400 species of native bee alone, are at risk of local extinction. So we know that's whatever's happening to honeybees, which are bred and replaced by beekeepers, is happening to native pollinators, but they don't have the help of sort of a breeding and replacement program. And, we know that, of course, that's a bad news for the ecosystem, but it's also bad news for crop pollination. So a study came out a couple of years ago finding that apples, blueberries, and cherries were pollinator limited nationwide, which means New York farmers, apple farmers are already growing fewer apples because there's not enough bees and other pollinators. And also particularly that there aren't enough wild bees. So honeybees are great, but you also need some wild bees if you're going to get that maximum production. And we know that the system of honeybee production right now, we know that our colonies are very weak. And again, I'm sure that there's impacts that this has to the ecosystem. Another good study actually came out on this from Harvard just a couple of months ago, finding that globally production of fruit and vegetables is down about 3 to 5% because of a lack of pollinators. So, okay, so we know that something is happening with pollinators. Why do we care so much about neonics? There's a lot of other factors affecting bees. There's climate change, habitat loss, parasites, pathogens, other pesticides. Why neonics in particular? Well, first, I think it's helpful to know something a little bit about neonics. So neonics are neurotoxic insecticides, which means they are pesticides designed to kill bugs by attacking their nerves. And the way they do that is they attach permanently to receptor sites in an insect's nervous system, and they stimulate those nerves until the nerve fails. So if you've seen a bee that has been acutely poisoned with neonics, that bee will start to tremble uncontrollably oftentimes before becoming paralyzed and dying. But again, a lot of pesticides kill bugs in gruesome ways. Why neonics? And there are three big reasons. So the first is that neonics are super duper toxic to bees and other insects. And to give you a sense of scale here, just one neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees or more. And we've seen neonics drive the harmfulness or toxicity of US agriculture since their introduction. And this is from a study that came out a couple of years ago, finding that neonics made US agriculture 48 times more harmful to insect life. And if you look, that spike in harmfulness happens in the mid-2000s, almost exactly at the same point that we see these sudden losses in honeybee colonies. So again, climate change a problem, parasites, pathogens a problem, habitat loss is a problem, but none of them match with that sudden spike in losses other than the sudden spike in use that we see on neonics, in particular their use on neonic treated corn and soybean seeds. Second problem with neonics is that they are just really good at contaminating entire ecosystems. So they're designed to permeate plants, to get into the leaves, the roots, the fruit, the pollen, the nectar, everything, essentially making the whole plant itself toxic to insect life, making the plant itself the pesticide. And that means they can be applied in all sorts of interesting ways. Of course, they can be sprayed, and they are, but more often they're applied directly to the soil or literally painted on crop seeds. And to give you a sense of what that looks like, here's some neonic treated corn seed and in a planting device. And here is a close-up of some corn seed. This is different corn seed. They use a different color. They don't always pick the same color. And the idea is that as that corn seed is growing into a plant, it literally soaks up the pesticide coating through its roots and becomes toxic. Now, the problem is only 2 to 5% of that coating makes it into the target plant. The other 95+% stays in the environment. Some is released during planting in these clouds of toxic dust. Most of it stays in the soil. And it remains in the soil for years. And anytime it rains, anytime there's irrigation, lawn watering, those neonics move through the soil to contaminate new soil. Right? They're moving with the rainwater, they dissolve in it. And in that new contaminated soil, if there are plants, those plants soak up the pesticides, they become toxic, their pollen, their nectar. Worth noting too, a lot of creatures live in the soil, including a lot of bees. Most bees are ground nesting. And if there's a water supply nearby, that water supply becomes polluted. So third problem with neonics is that they are just all over the place. They are the most popular insecticides in the United States. They're used on just about all conventional corn. Almost all conventional corn is pre-treated with a neonic before planting. So to give you a sense, in New York, that's over 1 million acres right off the bat, probably a couple 100,000 acres of soybean seeds as well. But they're also all over lawns, gardens, golf courses, you name it. And actually in those non-agricultural landscapes, they're approved at much higher rates per acre. So, and sometimes we actually see more contamination around urban and suburban sites because they're sort of, toxic hotspots for the use of these pesticides. And we've seen, in New York, neonic use go up and up and up over the years. And I know 2014 is not super recent, but that's the most recent year we have the seed data for, and the seeds are sort of the biggest piece of the puzzle. So you have to include that. And what I'll bring folks' attention to is this red square here, which is the use of just one neonic called imidacloprid. As you can see, it's not even the most used neonic in New York agriculture. This is a map of neonic use over the years and how it's grown across the country. And as you can see, this is a good portion of New York that's filled in. But a couple of things to notice here, this is just agricultural use. So if we were counting lawns, gardens, golf courses, Westchester would all be filled in. This portion of Long Island would all be filled in, right? And also if we were counting other neonic chemicals, right? This is just one of 5, not even the most used in New York agriculture. And yet we see it's all over the state. And so what is happening is you're having these pesticides used in the same area year after year. They're staying in the soil for years. So you get a buildup of toxicity over time. And that toxicity is constantly spreading out every time it rains to contaminate new soil, water, and plant life. And so what you get is almost ubiquitous contamination of huge areas of the state with a very highly toxic, among the most insect toxic insecticides mankind has ever created. We see that in New York water. We see neonics all over New York surface waters. We see them in the Long Island aquifer. They're the most commonly detected insecticides there. The levels that we're seeing neonics at are above EPA benchmark levels for harms to aquatic ecosystems, so very likely hollowing those ecosystems out from the bottom up. And the results are likely underestimates because they're just looking for imidacloprid most of the time. And again, not even the most used neonic in New York agriculture. Probably if they were looking for more of the neonic chemicals, they would be finding more contamination. Also worth noting that conventional chlorination treatment does not remove neonics from water supplies. Only advanced filtration does, granular active carbon filtration, but most water systems don't use that. So that's a sense of what the contamination issue is. What effect is it having? Well, the first is that neonics definitely kill bees. That one is pretty confirmed in the scientific literature. Again, it's sort of intuitive, right? Not hard to tell how that would happen, but now we have a lot of good science showing that that's the case and that neonics are a lead driver of pollinator losses. There's also some sense that, neonics are having effects directly on other insect life. So as you might imagine, if they're toxic to bees, they're toxic to a range of insects, and the contamination that we see is not good for insect life across the board. And, a lot of folks talk about the insect apocalypse. One place where you might see it is, if you recall, in the 1990s, driving through a rural area in the middle of summer, let's say August, you'd have to put your windshield wipers on whether it was raining or not, right? Just to get all the bugs off of your windshield. And think about, when is the last time that you have had to do that? And this is what entomologists call the windshield effect, or the windscreen effect. It's one of the places that we can see visibly what's happening in the environment. But for the most part, there is a massive hollowing out that's happening in front of our eyes. And, we're not really noticing it until you think about it. So beyond just our invertebrate friends, neonics have ripple effects that affect all species. So we know that neonics are linked with declines in birds and bird biodiversity. And that happens in 2 ways, but the first way is that neonics are just getting rid of the bird's food source. As it turns out, most birds need insects as an essential part of their diet. So if you have fewer bugs, you have fewer birds. And this chart is taken from a study that was done a couple years ago. And if folks remember, maybe about 3 years ago, there was a study from Cornell finding that over the last 50 years, we've lost 30%. Last 50 years, we've lost 30% of our bird population. So after that study came out, a couple of other scientists went through the data, and they broke down which birds are dying and which birds are not. And they broke the birds into sort of 2 categories: the ones that required insects as part of their diets, and those that didn't require insects as an essential part of their diet. And if you look, the birds that don't require insects as a part of their diet actually have done pretty well. Their populations have maintained or grown in some cases. But for the birds, and which is most of them, that do require insects as an essential part of their diet, those are the birds that are getting hammered. And again, that's in part because they are losing a major source of food. Same thing happens with fish. So this was a study out of Japan looking at the collapse of a sustainable fishery there. And the study authors were looking at zooplankton. And for those interested in knowing what zooplankton look like, these are zooplankton, essentially water bugs or water invertebrates. And they noticed that in the early 90s, the zooplankton just hit a wall, right? Those populations just fell off a cliff. And unsurprisingly, at the same time, catches of fish that ate that zooplankton also hit a wall, likely because they didn't have any food anymore and they starved. So nobody really knew what was happening in the early 90s, but the study authors later linked it to the introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture. And I'll note that the levels of neonics that we see in that water system match those commonly seen in a lot of water bodies in New York. So beyond those indirect effects, there are also some direct effects of neonics. And, first with birds, we know that one neonic treated seed has enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird. But even at levels that don't kill birds outright, they affect their survival systems. So they affect their neurological systems, their ability to migrate and to find food, their ability to navigate, their ability to fight off disease, their immune systems, and also their reproductive systems. So even if that neonic exposure doesn't kill a bird outright, it can weaken them to the point where ultimately they fail to survive if they fail to migrate or find food, or in the case of reproductive impacts, it could have impacts on the population and the survival of that population. Where things get scary is when we talk about large mammals. So several years ago, hunters in the upper Midwest noticed that funny things were happening with the deer that they were catching and killing. Strange things going on, sort of malformations they noticed with the deer. And they thought it could be connected to this new insecticide. So they did a controlled study. And in that controlled study, they found that lo and behold, neonic, sort of real world levels of neonics in water were associated with certain malformations of the jaw, decreased organ size, and also increased mortality for fawns that had been exposed in the womb. And they also found for the adults, lethargy and hypothyroidism, so things going on with their hormones, their endocrine system. And, the refrain from industry was, well, okay, even taking you at your word, these are not real world levels of neonics that deer are exposed to, right? Nobody's exposed to this much of the pesticide in the wild. So the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources did a test with hunters. They had hunters actually submit spleens to the agency. There were 800 spleens that were mailed to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And they found 61% had neonics in them, with 29% at levels associated with birth defects and death in the Berheim study. They redid that study 2 years later. And this is what's sort of shocking. Those numbers jumped, and quite considerably. So now they're finding neonics in virtually all deer in the state, and it didn't matter where those deer were caught, right? Whether that was in an agricultural area, an urban area, or even near the boundary waters and sort of, national park or state park areas that were nowhere near either agriculture or urban areas. It didn't matter where those deer had neonics in them, almost across the board, and 2/3 of them had neonics at levels associated with birth defects and death in the Berheim study for prenatal exposures. So, you might have guessed where this is going. Deer are large mammals, we're large mammals. We're not immune from neonic exposure either. CDC, based on 2016 data, found that about half the American population has neonics in their body on every given day. But a more recent study from 2017 to 2020, 171 pregnant women from New York and 4 other states found over 95% had neonics in their body. And this is what's scary, the frequency and detection of neonics over the course of that study steadily went up over the 4-year period. So with the highest rates in Hispanic women. So this is not to say that the reason we're seeing neonics rise in deer is the same reason we're seeing neonics rise in people in this study, but it is interesting that these numbers sort of map each other and that we see this steady increase in neonic exposure over time with those higher levels. And I should also note the Buckley study found higher levels than the CDC study. So by all accounts, exposure is getting worse for whatever reason. And that's a big concern because neonics are linked to birth defects of the heart and brain in human studies and the few studies that we have on neonics. They're linked to autism-like symptoms, and this is for prenatal exposures in the womb. And then in adults, we see effects on sperm. A lot of studies on that, sperm quantity and quality, and also hormonal shifts. So decreased testosterone and other sort of hormonal effects, which is mapping exactly what we see again in those animal studies. And I should note too, we see all these same things in the rodent studies as well. It's not just big mammals. So, you know, why are we so worried about neonics? I think on the human health side of things, certainly I think there's concerns for adult exposures and the fact that we're all sort of chronically exposed to a neurotoxin. And, and nerve damage is often permanent, so that's something to worry about. But it's really especially a problem with developing children, fetuses, young children, because these neurotoxic chemicals, similar to lead or mercury, affect nerves that are in delicate areas of our brain and central nervous system. So the thought is, like lead or mercury, that there may be no safe level. You might have heard that with those neurotoxins. This is from an op-ed in the Times Union from Dr. Phil Landrigan, who's sort of a famous a children's health researcher and advocate, and again, making the link between lead and mercury and neonic exposures. And it's also worth noting that, you know, these exposures are unequal. So from the Buckley study, we see higher exposures in Hispanic women, but we know that people can sort of avoid neonics reasonably okay if they eat organic produce, not completely, if they filter their water with a fancy filtration system, but not everybody has the ability to eat all organic or to put a filter on their water supply. It's also worth noting that, you know, and this comes out in the Harvard study as well, the loss of pollinators and the loss of fruit and vegetables that we have from a lack of pollinators is already affecting our food supply. And that lack of that produce and the higher expense associated with what's remaining impacts folks and it impacts their health. They actually calculated there's about 430,000 preventable deaths worldwide. And a good portion of those in countries like the US, where we know when there are less access to healthy fruits and vegetables, that hits folks in low-income communities especially hard. So that's sort of the holistic problem with neonics, a big problem for the environment, a growing concern for people, and what some have likened to sort of a second silent spring. What are folks doing about it? Well, the EU banned most of the major neonic chemicals for outdoor use. They did a partial ban in 2013, and they expanded that ban in 2018 to just about all outdoor uses of the major neonic chemicals. Quebec and Ontario have largely phased out of using neonic-treated corn and soybean seed, which is by far the largest use in the US. EPA hasn't done a whole lot. They came out with some proposed decisions a couple of years ago that basically blessed the status quo, which is continued widespread use. They're going to come out with some new proposed decisions this year, or at least they say they will. But we know from other pesticide issues, EPA, typically does not take a strong stance on prohibiting pesticides, and it takes quite a lot for the agency to move on that. So we're not expecting big things out of those decisions. And that really kicks the responsibility to the states to do something. And New Jersey and Maine they ban neonic uses on most non-agricultural landscapes. A number of other states have made neonics restricted use, and I should actually add New York here. New York has, as of January 1st, made neonics restricted use. Most non-agricultural products in New York restricted use. And what that means is they can be used only by a certified applicator, but the two big loopholes there is it doesn't include the pesticide treated seeds, and it doesn't include, and most landscape use, if you think of any landscaper, they're going to have a certified applicator, or they're going to contract with a certified applicator. So lawns, a lot of lawns, anything that's being tended by somebody, or golf courses, you're still going to see a lot of neonic use there. So a good first step, but certainly it can't be the last one, because we know most of the use is happening outside of that. So in New York, we have the Birds and Bees Protection Act. And this is a bill that comes out of research from Cornell University. So Cornell looked at over 1,100 peer-reviewed papers, basically everything that had been written on neonics and pollinators up until that point, which was 2020. And they looked at use by use, and importantly, what they did is a cost-benefit analysis, not just looking at neonics and what impacts they had, but if they got rid of neonics, what would be the replacement, and what sort of costs would that impose? Because with a pesticide, you always have to ask, not is the pesticide bad, but if we got rid of it, what would be the replacement? And there were two big things that study found. The first is that the neonic treated corn, soybean, and wheat seeds, which is by far the largest use in New York and nationwide, provided no overall net income benefit to farmers. So to break that down a little bit more, very rarely did you see a yield benefit, but even when you do see that benefit, if you factor the extra price of the pesticide on the seed, economically, it's a wash. And then it also found that the turf and ornamental uses, the lawn and garden uses, in most cases were not needed. We're totally prophylactic and unnecessary, sort of like taking an antibiotic now, just in case you may get sick in the summer. So most of those uses not needed and at all, but even in the 20% of cases where you might want to use an insecticide, there were a number of safer, effective alternatives available. And so the bill bans just those two uses, just the neonic treated corn, soybean, and wheat seeds, and just the turf and ornamental uses. There's some exceptions in there for invasive species treatment. There are ways to relax the ban if neonic treated seeds aren't commercially available. But it's really in a lot of ways a surgical bill, right? If you think about it, the only agricultural use affected is the neonic treated corn, soybean, and wheat seeds. But even then, a corn farmer would be able to use a soil application or a spray application or apply later in the season. They just wouldn't be able to have it on the seed. So it doesn't even really prohibit the use on any particular crop fully. It just addresses those uses that were shown to be not needed. And luckily, those uses account for 80 to 90% of the neonic use in New York, which is great. We can address the heart of the problem by eliminating those uses that are high cost and low benefit. I call them dumb uses here, but I mean, you get the point. So what happened with the bill? It passed last year in the Assembly by a pretty big margin. It didn't get a vote in the Senate, but it did pass in the Senate the year before by a pretty big margin. But legislation is not horseshoes, right? We got to pass it in both houses in the same year and get it signed by the governor. So the bill was reintroduced. I should update this slide. It was reintroduced in the Senate, and then it was reintroduced in the Assembly as well. So these are the new bill numbers: A3226, that's Assembly Member Glick, and S1856, that's Senator Hoylman-Siegel. And, they have to go through the normal legislative process now. They have to go through committee, get to the floor and get voted on and signed by the governor in order to become law. So that's what we're going to try and do this year. We're really working on this bill. We think hopefully this is the year we're going to get it done. I think we're in a pretty good position, about as good as we've ever been, but we're facing some opposition from the chemical industry and certain sort of farming interests, corn and soybean farmers. So it's going to be, I think, a big push, but hopefully we can get over the finish line. And Lena can talk a little bit about what we're planning to do along those lines.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Dan. So there's quite a few ways that folks can get involved in advocacy on different levels. One of the first things, if you own a business or are part of a gardening group or a bird group or anything like that, have a farm, we have a coalition letter that we ask people to sign on to if they'd like to support the bill, and I can share that with folks. We also now have a petition up for individuals to sign on to support the bill as well, and we can also share that link. One of the big ones is contacting your representatives. So phone calls are always best. They're the most impactful, but letters are great too. Emails are great. I just heard from a group that we talked to back in January, I think, who had a letter writing campaign. So that's exciting. Things like that are always welcome. The more your representatives hear about it, the better. We also had lobby days. So we had our first virtual lobby day end of January, and we're going to have our first in-person lobby day in Albany on February 27th. So if folks are interested in getting involved in that, we'd be happy to have you join us up in Albany. But we'll definitely have more opportunities, especially in the spring, for lobby days as well. Another way, writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor, to your local papers. That's always a great way to just get attention in your local government. And then encouraging your local leaders, or if you know folks who are in different groups in the area that might be interested in getting involved in advocacy, just getting the word out there, sharing it on social media. And again, if you're interested in any of that, you can email me at that email. I'll also put it in the chat so folks can copy it too. Yeah, and if you think of anything else, those ideas are welcome too.
So I think we can go to questions now. I'll stop the share. Yeah.
Wow, that's depressing.
It's kind of a lot, but the good news is, unlike PFAS or PCBs or some of these other forever chemicals, I mean, it takes a while for neonics to get out of the environment. They do have relatively long half-lives in soil, but they're not forever chemicals. So if we can fix this problem, we can reverse this problem. You can get out of the hole if you just stop digging. And I think that's what this issue is.
Do you have any way of knowing who's using it? Should we just assume that every cornfield around here in the Rondout Valley is using Neonics?
If they're conventional, yes, that would be a very good assumption. If they're organic, they would not be using it. You actually can't use these in organic agriculture. So I think it would just depend, who's growing that corn. And there actually is a pretty substantial organic corn industry in New York, although certainly the conventional cornfields are, a much larger share.
And Belmont, you have a question?
Yes, I wondered about what we can do to stop the stuff being sold in hardware stores, like Home Depot and so on.
So the good news is that should no longer be sold. Neonic home products should no longer be sold in New York because of the action that DEC took to make them restricted use. So you should only be able to buy them now, with the exception of certain tree products for invasive species. You should only be able to buy them if you were a certified applicator. So you would have to show your license, and then they could sell you it wouldn't be what you'd find on the normal shelves. But again, anybody who hires a landscaper or a pest control specialist, there's just huge use there. If you live next to a golf course, you can almost guarantee they're using Neonics. So it doesn't get everything.
Is there a brand name that they're selling it under? They're not calling it Neonics.
No, so and the thing is, nothing would say Neonics on it. So the only way to know if a product has a neonic in it, you'd have to know the 5 big chemical names, right, of the major neonic chemicals, and then you'd have to look at the pesticide label and see if that label had one of those chemical names on it. So it is a bit tricky. But again, the consumer products, there should be a clampdown on that in New York now. But the major products on lawns is going to be Merit. Although there's a bunch of other brand names, they're actually off patent now. So a bunch of different people make them. So there's not just one manufacturer. And one of the bigger lines on the home product side, garden products, was Bayer Advanced. That's now Bio Advanced. Again, that hopefully is not going to be sold anymore in New York, but those were a major line of neonic containing products. I should also note, I didn't talk about in the presentation, neonics are all over indoor products as well, veterinary products, a lot of flea and tick treatments, flea collars, etc. So you can find neonics in all sorts of places. They're pretty much all over the place.
I was interested in the fact that it was showing up in the boundary water canoe area. I was thinking about the problem with PFAS, where they found it actually in polar bears. Is there signs that it's being transmitted maybe by air or over long distances?
So you could have transmission by air, but again, the advantage with neonics over something like, say, PFAS is that because they're not forever chemicals, if they're in air long enough, they'll break down, and they break down at different rates in different environments. So they persist for a really long time in soil, which unfortunately is where most of them are, right? That's where they're applied. But they break down more quickly in air and when they're exposed to sort of light. So I don't think you're going to find neonics in polar bears. I don't know, maybe they will find them up there. And certainly at planting time, you have these clouds of neonic dust. So there is some air transmission, but the big transmission with neonics is going to be in rainwater or irrigation. And again, just sort of leaching through the environment. Well, I should also note too that the other sort of, for humans, one of the other pathways is through food, right? Food and water. But, if you have an apple that's treated with neonics, the pesticides are literally in the apple, so you remember when people used to tell you to wash and peel your food? Well, you can't really do that with, neonics.
You said earlier that that organic food could have it too, didn't you?
So organics have much lower levels of neonics than conventional, and in a lot of cases they don't have many at all. But the issue with neonics, again, is that they're such good environmental contaminants. It's sometimes hard to avoid that contamination. So for example, if you're an organic farmer that's sitting next to a golf course or a conventional cornfield, those neonics may leach onto your land. So you may not have put them in your crops, but it could still get into the soil where you've planted your crops, even more so for irrigation, right? If neonics are in the water supply and you're irrigating your crops with neonic contaminated water, there's a good chance that those neonics are going to get into the crop. So in studies of neonics in food, for the most part, we see, again, much lower levels and much lower percentages of neonics in organic food. So definitely it's a way to reduce, but it's not foolproof. We still do see some neonics appear in that produce. And again, that's just a testament to the ubiquity of the pesticides in the environment. one interesting thing is, that deer study, they had a control group, right? And they had other deer that were drinking the water at certain levels. But what they found is at the end of the study that the control group had neonics in their bodies too. And even though they tried to control every aspect of the environment so that it wouldn't happen, it just shows you that the pesticide contamination is so ubiquitous that you can't, to some extent, you can't get a control anymore, a nice clean control. So.
Aside from, sorry, Anna, I'll get to you. I just have one question. Aside from the food crops, when we buy plants at a nursery, we want to buy pollinator plants, and let's just say go to Home Depot or someplace or another conventional nursery who has also, they also have native plants as well. They probably have neonics as well, right?
Most conventional nurseries are going to be using neonics. They really want those plants to look perfect and, not have any insect damage. So, the easiest way to do that is sort of pump them full of neonics. So conventional nurseries, I know a lot of them do use neonics, if not most. It's different with nurseries that are focused on native species. I think a lot of them try to avoid those types of pesticides. And also, I think a lot of those species are more resistant to some of the insect damage that we see with non-natives. So I think you have a better shot with a native nursery. I think the best course of action is to just ask your nursery provider whether they use these pesticides or not. That also sends a market signal. Like right now, the markets are primed to give you perfect looking plants. And so they're just going to do everything to make sure those plants are perfect. But if they know that their consumers put a premium on not having these pesticides in the plants, then that's going to change their economic calculus.
Anne, you had your hand up?
I was just wondering about the water supply. If you say you live, a dozen miles from a cornfield where they're using neonics, is your water going to be contaminated?
A dozen miles. I've seen neonics travel. I think I'm trying to think of the studies I've seen. I've seen some pretty decent migration, maybe even up to a couple of miles. I guess it would depend on what sort of the water table is doing in that area. A dozen miles is a pretty healthy distance.
I just wonder, where we live is on the edge of state land, and it's, I don't think it's pretty sparsely, the lawns there are not a lot of lawns around here where I don't think people are using a lot of pesticides. And yet our level of insects is still, you can still really notice that there's a lot of missing insects.
Yeah, I mean, there are, I think especially with that recent deer study, right, where we're finding neonics in deer around the boundary waters, that's raised some eyebrows. And, I think we don't know yet how widely these pesticides migrate in the environment. And if you think about it, if we do continually have that buildup, right, in soils where they are being used, and they're migrating over long periods of time, maybe the migration issue is a lot bigger than we realized before. That being said, you're in a better position than if you were like right next to a golf course. And full disclosure here, from the water data that I've seen, the highest concentrations of neonics in water are from wells that are next to golf courses. Per acre, those are some of the highest uses out there.
Is there any consumer tests that you can test your water for neon?
No, unfortunately, the neonic tests are I think a bit expensive. Maybe for the full suite of 5 neonics, you're looking at a couple $100. I know the Cornell lab was doing testing for people at one point, But it's, you know, it's complicated to get those samples taken in the proper way and then to mail that to the lab and to get it done. So it is something that you can do. You're going to have to be committed to doing it if you want to do it. And you know, that's obviously part of the problem.
I was looking at a map a few days ago. I'll get to you, Shelley, also, and then Michael after that, of Westchester. It's almost wall-to-wall golf courses and lakes for reservoirs for New York City water.
If you look at the pesticide use map that DEC puts out, and this is all pesticide use, I think Westchester has the highest pesticide use of any county by far. It's just, they use a lot of pesticides in Westchester.
Yeah. Shelley, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm in Wisconsin, in the heart of soybeans and corn. A couple of years ago, I got interested in neonics and contacted the University of Wisconsin. Potato growers are financing a lot of stuff at the UW, including a fellow who was studying neonics in potatoes. Turns out, because it's a systemic, neonics are in potatoes that we eat. And I am curious to know, because I've never seen one of these, whether any organization has done a percentage calculation of what fruits and vegetables have the most neonics in them. So that at least when we go to the grocery store, we're looking at potatoes and apples and carrots and all those other things. We can make some sort of judgment about whether or not that's something we want to eat. Have you ever heard of such a list?
Yeah, so I think Friends of the Earth did a study on it. There's been a couple of studies on neonics in food. Craddock is the name of one study that came out, was sort of the lead author on that paper. And they found, it sort of breaks it down by produce group, and they also found neonics in baby food in reasonably high numbers, which is alarming. I don't know, when it comes to the grains and starches, I haven't seen as much testing on that. Most of the testing I've seen has been on fruits and veggies. So, and potatoes for sure would be a crop you'd expect neonics to be in. They definitely use neonics in potato production. But I don't know if anybody's tested potatoes. And funnily enough, I haven't seen any testing on corn or soybean either. So, but yeah, there are some studies on fruits and vegetables, and I don't know those off the top of my head. Craddock is one, C-R-A-D-D-O-C-K is the lead author. But if you search in Google for that, you'll find it.
Thank you.
Michael?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Dan, excellent authoritative presentation. Really enjoyed it and learned a lot. You mentioned pets, pet collars. Would a homeowner be able to, a pet owner be able to just read the box that the pet collar came in to know that it has or does not have neonics?
Yeah, so yes, if you knew the name of all the neonic chemicals. And probably the big ones that you would need to know, I think, are imidacloprid, clothianidin, and acetamiprid.
And they're all listed. Were they listed on your slide presentation? And will we be able to get a copy of that?
I don't, they're all listed in the bill name. So if you look up the bill, that's A3226,
Okay.
that has all 5 chemicals in there.
Okay.
I think you're going to see more and more on acetamiprid, especially. There's some concerns about human health with that one in particular. And there was actually a good study by USDA on the Seresto pet collar that's been linked to 1,700 pet deaths over a 10-year period. So some of these pet collars are pretty toxic. And talking with our staff scientists, a lot of them don't work as well as advertised, maybe. So, but yes, you should be able to find that, but you would have to know the names of the neonic chemicals.
And is there a way that the neonics migrate to humans from pet collars?
I think it's a concern, yeah. I mean, so with any sort of pesticide treated pet collar, again, some of the biggest concerns are for young children, because they sort of get right in there and they put their face on there. And, you know, I would also worry about kids in lawn uses. Actually, EPA, the one thing it did in their, you know, not really helpful proposed decisions a couple of years ago is they proposed to get rid of imidacloprid lawn sprays, not because of risk to bees, but because of risk to people, right? And the thought is that, you know, young kids go out and they put the dirt in their mouths. And I wouldn't have believed it until I had two kids of my own. I have twin 5-year-olds now, but I know at the age of 2 to 3, I mean, it just amazed me, the stuff that they would put in their mouth. So yeah, I think lawn exposures and pet exposures are a concern. And that's not just for neonics, that's for a whole range of pesticides. And actually NRDC has a bunch of stuff on that and pet collars specifically.
Thank you.
Todd?
Yeah, I was wondering, since neonics is not identified as if I were to go, we get our vegetables usually from a local CSA in the spring. If I were to ask them, are they using neonics, how would they know?
Well, the farmer would know, but I guess, yeah, if the vendor there isn't also the grower, they may not know.
CSA we go through as an organic farm.
Oh, if it's organic, then no. The answer is no.
Okay, but I mean, there's no, in other words, there's no way of listing these things by brand name as opposed to by chemical.
There's a number of brand names. So again, neonics are off patent. So, you know, for any given crop, I don't know, there's probably at least a dozen products used to treat them in different ways. And they can do all sorts of things. They can put it on the seed, they can spray it, they can put it in the soil. They can use something called chemigation, where they put, you know, neonics into the irrigation water. And that's actually what they do. It's called chemigation. So all sorts of different ways to apply it, all sorts of different products. The surest way to know what it is to, you know the chemical names.
But
But you may not even know that, you know, a particular chemical is a neonic. It's like, oh, I don't use neonics, I use the imidacloprid.
That's what my question is. They may be innocent. They may think they're not doing it.
Yeah, and well, there was a good study out on farmers a couple of years ago that a lot of them didn't even know they had neonics on their seed, right? Because what happens is, you know, farmers are buying, especially in the conventional market, they're buying seeds from seed dealers. The seeds come with 3 genetic modifications and maybe 3 pesticides on the seed. And, you know, you buy the meal deal, and they also maybe give you a discount on Roundup later in the season. So you buy it all from one shop. And the way the system works now is that the largest seed producers are also the chemical producers, right? And they've gotten even bigger in recent years. There used to be Monsanto and Bayer, but now that's Bayer, Monsanto, or just Bayer. There used to be Dow and DuPont, but they merged and became Corteva, their ag business. There used to be Syngenta and ChemChina, and they merged. So it was already a field dominated by a lot of the big players, but yeah, the folks that are making the seeds these days are also the chemical producers.
So would you say that all pesticides being used right now are neonics or?
Oh, no, there's all sorts of other pesticides out there. You know, herbicides especially, right? There's a lot of herbicide use. Neonics are the most used insecticide. So an herbicide is designed to kill a plant, an insecticide is designed to kill an insect, a nematicide is designed to kill a nematode. But neonics are the most used insecticide out there. But, you know, what we've learned is it's the potency of the product matters, right? So actually what some producers will tell you, it's like, well, the volume of insecticide use has gone down. Well, sure, maybe the volume has gone down, although unclear, right? Because we don't have good tracking on seeds. The volume may have gone down, but it's sort of like saying, well, I used to drink 40 ounces of beer a day, and now I only drink 10 ounces of grain alcohol. Well, okay, you know, you have reduced the volume, but you might need to go to the hospital, right? Because the potency matters, and that's certainly what we see with Neonics. And I'm sorry, I am going to have to jump right at the hour. If you can believe it or not, I have another call in 2 minutes. But I'd be happy to. I think Lena can stay on the line, and I'd be happy to get in contact with anybody else that's interested on taking other action on this. But I just emphasize what she presented on. You know, reaching out to electeds is one of the most potent things that you can do. We think we have a really smart common sense bill. We think New York on this issue, like so many others, it's important that we have, you know, a state leading the way, and the Empire State is often the one that does that. And so, you know, we're hoping for good things this year.
Thank you so much. Tina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you all. Thanks for having me.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions for Lena, possibly?
Yeah, and I can mostly answer questions about action taking. I can always write down
good. Let's do
questions for
that.
Dan, but
Take some
I'm not
action.
as well versed as Dan is on the nitty
Definitely
gritty
need-
details.
Is there a way to know who, which senators are voting against? Well, they haven't voted yet, I suppose, right? So we don't know.
Yep, so if you look up each of the bill numbers, so A3226 and S1856, you can see who has co-sponsored the bill so far. So if you don't see the name on the co-sponsor, then they haven't co-sponsored yet. And then, yeah, they haven't voted on it yet. It's in both environmental committees right now, so it has to go through those committees first. And but yeah, if you look up the bill, you can see who is a co-sponsor so far.
When is the vote going to be? You have any idea?
I am not sure. I know that they're in the midst of budget right now, so I assume it probably won't be for a bit.
Do you,
Lena,
do you
would you-
have any sense of whether the governor would be willing to sign such a bill?
It's tough. I know we kind of really don't have a good idea. I know last year there was some sense that it was a controversial bill just because of how the Farm Bureau feels about it. And it was an election year. So hopefully this year, since it's not an election year, we won't have as difficult a time getting it through the Assembly, getting it through the Senate, and then hopefully the governor will sign on. But I know that she was signing on to bills, you know, in the end of December this past year. So it you know, it can go right up to the end of the year. So it's definitely, if we get it through both, you know, the Assembly and the Senate by June, which is, we have until June 8th, that's when the session ends. And then the rest of the year will be focused on getting the governor on board.
How many senators are there in New York State?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know the number off the top of my head.
And we can,
Let's see.
so, you know, if we find that out, we can contact all of them, right? We're not limited, like, I think in our district, we're only allowed to speak to our representatives.
So yeah, you can contact any senator. It is a well-known kind of thought that senators are more, any representative is more focused on those in their district and care more about what the people in their district have to say. But it doesn't limit you if you contact those other folks. That's definitely welcome. It doesn't hurt. So.
But Dan had said that this bill has already passed in both the Senate and the Assembly in the past. So it sounds like they're, you know, we're in a good position for having both of the chambers pass it, and possibly I'm just talking off the top of my head, because I know that Governor Hochul failed to, or vetoed a bill in December that had to do with giving municipalities the right to define their own I think it was pesticides, and you know, to increase beyond the state standards, and she vetoed that. So that's not a good sign. So my point is simply that if you're going to expend some energy, it might be better spent on the governor's level rather than the Assembly or Senate level.
Yeah, and I can definitely echo that. I think that that is a smart move. Yeah, like you said, we got it passed in the assembly last year, just didn't get to a vote in the Senate. So hopefully we'll get it passed in both houses right away, and then, yeah, just focus on the governor.
So should we just write letters to the governor now, or should we wait?
I think you can do it from now until the end of the year. I think as much, as much noise as possible to your representatives and to the governor's office. I know that in May and June, that's going to be a real push for getting it passed in the Assembly and the Senate. So it'll be good to focus, late April through May, early June on the Assembly and the Senate. But you can focus on all of them right now. That's great.
And Lena, will you give us those two numbers one more time, please?
Yep, it's A3226 and
Mhm.
then S1856.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you guys for
Thank you.
coming and tuning in. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you for a really horrifying third
I
Thursday.
know. It's not going to get much better next week, but at least we'll have some options. What are you going to do? That's the age we're in.